Yeah, you know what we should do? We should put more money into bills that says, don't say gay. I think that's a good place to put your money. I think we should put more money into mental health services. And the fact of the matter is you're not really interacting with the fact that there is a racial bias to this.
Every disparity that you recognize on the basis of race does not mean that racism is the sole factor.
I'll hand my mic in. We can fight later.
We can fight later.
All right, we'll now have time for questions. If you have questions, please line up.
Given that in the status quo, Black and Latino neighborhoods are being over-policed, would you be in support of divesting away from traditional police forces and into proactive public service programs?
Not necessarily. I'm not into the divest revest thing, and I do take issue with the over-policed idea. And this is through just looking into it and anecdotal experience of being in a neighborhood that is often used as an example of being over-policed. So when you see a narrative of Black and Latino people being over-policed, and then you hear from said people in the neighborhood saying, no, I want more police here, our neighborhood is being damaged by people who are engaging in criminal activity, then the storyline starts to break for me. As far as divest and revest, I think there should be considerable investment in proactive measures. The biggest thing that happens in these communities where young children are engaging in drug activity, gang-related activity, is a lack of parental influence and lack of resources. So yes, invest in resources, but don't take away from police officers to do that.
Yeah, kind of speaking on the over-policing aspect of it, if you take like the NYPD, for example, which has had a budgetary increase over the last 10 years up to $1 billion, we've seen that crime has steadily increased. And kind of taking into account the fact that Black and Latinos account for 28% of the population, but for 58% of the prison population, right? Would you not also argue that there is a clear racial bias in the system?
That disparity does not point to bias. It actually points to cultural problems. So you actually have a higher rate. Yes, and this will sound, people view this as a racist thing to say. It's not a racist thing to say. You have a higher rate of criminality. And when you look at this, it's specifically among young African-American and Latino males. So this is something that is happening. It is normal. It is something that should be able to be acknowledged. But every disparity that you recognize on the basis of race does not mean that racism is the sole factor.
And I completely understand that. But at the same breath, right, the fact that 1 in 3 Black men have a chance of going to prison in their lifetime. And so if you look at these neighborhoods, they have statistically like double, triple the amount of police officers, and the police officers trained to go out and be more aggressive towards these people. You wouldn't argue that that kind of indicates a racial bias, but
police officers, and speaking as somebody who works directly with police officers, are not trained to go out and be more aggressive. In fact, if anything, we are dealing with the exact opposite problem, and we are decriminalizing things that should be criminalized across the United States of America, which is leading to a massive crime wave. Police officers are demoralized. And if we're talking about investing in proactive measures, what do those proactive measures solve? They solve
exactly what
influence, they solve resource. And if we're acknowledging they don't have influence and they don't have resource, we are acknowledging a cultural problem within these two communities.
Yeah, but let's kind of talk about this, your anecdotes, because I think your anecdotes are really cool, but I think also the empirics are equally important. The fact is, when you're spending $1 billion arming goons to, flood the streets, right? You crowd out investment into mental health services. You crowd out investment into rehabilitation. If you look at parole and probation, when people get arrested, we spend more money making sure that these people harass and can't cross state borders or have to travel across town to go to parole meetings.
To that.
I'm saying, yeah, but at the same time, you're also sympathetic to the police officers that are following this mission to go arrest more people.
There's plenty of other fat being spent in places in this country that should not have ever. We just sent how many billions of dollars to Ukraine?
Wow.
How many billions of dollars to Ukraine?
Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine. We spent billions of dollars to kill Iraqis. I think sending money to Ukraine is a little better.
If you want to talk about where money should be divested, it's from places that are not being spent on the American people, and it should come back to the American people.
Yeah, you know what we should do? We should put more money into bills that says, don't say gay. I think that's a good place to put your money. I think we should put more money into mental health services. And the fact of the matter is you're not really interacting with the fact that there is a racial bias to this, and you're saying, oh, let's blame the culture. But the fact is, when you've had a system of prison, which goes back to literally the Jim Crow and slave codes, right, you can't avoid that there is a racial bias. And I think it's important that we acknowledge that, at least the history and how it is transcended into the modern day. He's giving me an evil side eye. I'll hand my mic in. We can fight later.
We can fight later.
Okay. Last question from Julia.
Hi.
Hi.
All right. I'm looking at a Brookings Institute article right now, and it's talking about the difference in the wealth gap between Black and white Americans.
Yes.
And how a lot of that is tied to the gap in home ownership between Black and white Americans.
Yeah.
And how that is tied to Jim Crow, which you already acknowledged was a racist part of our country's history.
Sure.
So given all of those facts and the links between them, I'm curious how you would say that the wealth gap in the United States and the ramifications of that wealth gap on people's educational attainment and the communities that they live in, and how that leads to, different opportunities and resources. How would you say that's not evidence of systemic racism?
Okay, so the systemic racism of the past is acknowledged, as well as its generational effect. That's acknowledged, but you also have to figure out what portion of the pie that actually is. How much has Jim Crow affected a wealth gap that Black Americans have continued and seemingly will continue to experience through all sort of economic graphing, despite how much policy we are putting forth in the name of diversity, equity, and inclusion to quote unquote help Black people. Now, a really interesting book to read is this book called Discrimination and Disparities by Tom Sowell, where he talks about the wealth income gap between Black and white Americans. And he talks about this period specifically within Jim Crow America, where the white income wealth gap and the white poverty rate stayed just about the same for about 20 years. And during that 20 years, which I'll restate was in the middle of Jim Crow, the Black poverty rate dropped by about 40 percentage points. So in the middle of legislated racism by the government, the Black poverty rate was decreasing at levels that we've never seen before. And then suddenly we get into the civil rights movement, and Lyndon B. Johnson becomes president and institutes all this social welfare systems and incentivizes single mothers, and that poverty rate starts to stop decreasing. So it's all about pointing out what slices of the pie are due to things like racism. And by all means, if you can point out distinct generational wealth problems that can be solved, I don't know, with what we're proposing to solve it with, like California's running with reparations right now, which I'm very much against. But how do we solve that sliver? But also how much of that is dealing with other problems that have nothing to do with racism? When every single issue that we talk about now as a country, we see that disparate impact and we go racism, 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 and it actually shields us away from so many other blatantly obvious things that are affecting the people that we claim to be advocating for and doing nothing about. The rate of fatherlessness within the Black community, which is high in other races, but higher in the Black community than any other race. We're talking like 74% with young Black Americans. That leads you to an increased risk of homelessness, jail time, suspension, expulsion, obesity, chronic illness, suicide, rape, anything you can name. Having a father that's not in the home is going to affect you in that way, in some way. So why are people not up in arms, like screaming in the streets about the lack of fathers in the home? It's not happening. Yeah.
So you've spoken to the idea of cultural values or cultural issues within, you sort of specified on like the Black community. What do you just, you're like, that's sort of random that happened, or do you think that there's systemic issues at play there?
No, I don't think it's necessarily random that it happened. I do think there are just cultural proclivities. Like if you look at Asian Americans are a minority in this country, although we forget and we don't treat them like a minority because we don't feel bad for them. Asian Americans have gone through so many transgressions in American history, yet culturally stay in nuclear households, value education, value hard work at a very young age, and don't see any of the economic impacts of the past racist transgressions that they've gone through in this country instituted by this government. You don't see Asians taking to the streets talking about this effect on them. So clearly there's a cultural difference between the Asian population, the white population, and the Black population. So Yes, there's cultural choices that Black Americans make, and this is widely studied, but there's also social policies that have been implemented that have a disparate impact. Lyndon B. Johnson's a great example. When he came in, he instituted a social welfare system, and he said, you know what, if you're a single mother living in your household, the government is going to give you more money. And he actually instituted a rule called the man in the house rule, where they would send government officials to houses to check if there was an able-bodied man who was capable of working in the house. And if he was, your welfare was stripped away from you. So we saw this uptick in houses all across different races, just being single mother households with a bunch of kids. So there's policy and legislation that is affected, but there's also a very clear cultural problem within the Black community that leads to fatherlessness.
Let's give the speaker a hand.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming.